Good morning. I am Sylvie Naville, the director of Emerging Markets Forum, and I'm here today with Harinder Kohli, which is the founder, president, and CEO of Emerging Markets Forum, and we are here today to present our latest publication, Envisioning 2060 Opportunities and Risks for Emerging Economy. So I will introduce you very briefly, Harinder, who has a long experience in emerging market issues. He created the Emerging Market Forum in 2005. He is also the president of Centennial Group, which is a consulting companies, which also has helped many companies interested in emerging market, but multilateral institution in establishing their strategy in emerging market economies. And he also spent a long time with the World Bank in Washington. And previous to that, he also had business experience in France and in India. And Harinder is also the background an engineer, Harinder? True. And so after leaving the World Bank, he had these ideas of creating a forum for emerging economies to have a discussion on the vision and sharing practices and to reflect on the major challenges facing emerging markets economies today. We have a global meeting every year, and we also have Africa Emerging Market Forum, Latin America, and also Central Asia and the Caucasus. We just had our global meeting, the 15th edition in Paris from very recently, from 16 to 18, in collaboration with the Central Bank of France. We had 150 high-level participants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa. We even had with us the president of Côte d'Ivoire, and it was also we presented our last publication. And I will stop here, and I will ask Harinder to develop more on the main issues and conclusion of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. And after your introduction, I wonder whether I should continue, because, you know, Sylvie lives next to Mont Blanc in Chamonix area, and I'm thinking that when you're at top of the mountain after her introduction, the only thing to do is to go down. But since we are here in this lovely city of Barcelona, I have to say something. So thank you, Sylvie. Buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here in your lovely city, in Catalonia, in Spain, and I will try to do my best to live up to modestly to Sylvie's introduction. I want to really thank CASA for hosting us, and to Pedro for organizing this meeting and his colleagues. And I hope, Pedro and your colleagues, your management, this will be the first of many such occasions that we can develop a long-term relationship, because I think it's very important that the work we do at the Emerging Markets Forum, that we do have ways of connecting with people, not only in Spain, but your outreach within Europe and to North Africa, to Latin America at large. And therefore, we're lucky that we have with us Don Enrique, our very distinguished an honored co-chairman, and he'll be, of course, speaking to us after this first part of our session about the challenges of Latin America. Let me say that our book is a product of 20 authors from all over the world, and it is an effort to envision where the world may be, not will be, maybe, could be some 35 years from today. Our strength, our forum strength is twofold. One is a focus on emerging markets, and second, in thinking long-term, not short-term. Short-term kind of issues are strength of institutions like IMF. Our strength is long-term, and I want to make that distinction. The other thing I want to say is that this book is an effort of a year-long work by people who know their work inside out. I could humbly say that the people who worked on this project are some of the best experts on the subject in the world. For example, Mr. Garcia knows Latin America inside out, and I hope you'll take the time to read his chapter. And I'm sure after his talk that you'll be very intrigued, not only with what he says, but then you'll be encouraged to read his chapter. And the same is true with people who've written about productivity or about Africa, about the need for reform of the global monetary system or climate change. I'll come to that. The other thing, before I go further, is to say this book was written before the tragedy which is still unfolding before our eyes in Ukraine. The book went to publishers before that. But we did have in Paris a session on the impact of these recent geopolitical developments on the global economy, what is likely to happen to commodity prices, to the financial sector, to the global growth rates, to the value chains. Nobody knows, at least we don't, about when the war will end, how it will end, what will happen to sanctions to Russia, and the longer-term impact. Would Russia really reintegrate with the world? Under what conditions? So we had a fascinating session on that. And the book doesn't cover that, obviously. But having said that, let me make 3 points. 4, actually. One, the conclusion that session and the modeling work we did after the book was published is that in the medium to long term, the impact of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, in the medium to long term, not in the short term, despite the upheaval we have, politically and economically and financially, in the medium to long term, unless there's a disaster, which is still a possibility, in the medium to long term, the impact on the global economy will be relatively modest because the overall size of the Russian economy is not very big. Russia is only the 12th to 13th largest economy in the world. Smaller than not only Germany and France and UK, but even Italy. Yes, it is a huge military power. Yes, it's the largest nuclear power in the world. But in economic terms, except for oil and gas, it's not a big economy in the world. And for that reason, we think that beyond the short-term dishevel, in the medium to long term, there will not be a huge impact. Having said that, what does the book say? The book overall presents a fairly optimistic view of where the world could be in 2060. And it will be driven by two basic forces. We think, the 20 authors combined think. One is unfolding of continuous technological developments and innovations in the world. And second, by emerging and developing economies, particularly in East Asia, and perhaps by India. These two forces combined would lead the world to show a fairly robust and encouraging growth. Having said that, having presented this basic optimistic outcome, if all goes well, and there's no guarantee that all will go well. The book does present multiple scenarios based on fairly robust model, scenarios, not projections. And within those two scenarios, we're painting two contrasting outcomes. One is a fairly optimistic scenario, and I'll paint that for you in a minute. And second, unfortunately, a pessimistic scenario if things don't go well, both at the global level and the country level. What will make the most difference in determining which of these two extreme scenarios may come to pass? In our view, there are three overriding issues as to how the world tackles these three overriding issues, both at the global level and the major country level. Number one, climate change. Are we able, as a world, are we able to keep the temperature rise closer to 1.5 degrees? We're already over 1%. Can we keep it closer to 1.5 degrees and definitely below 2 degrees? If it is 2 degrees or more, then the optimistic scenario is out of our reach. Second, inequalities. Unfortunately, while the inequality of incomes between rich and poor countries have been closing, and our model suggests that between countries inequalities are likely to continue to come down because the developing countries will continue to do well. So the gap between advanced countries and emerging countries will narrow. But unfortunately, inequalities within countries, not only US and France, etc., advanced countries, the inequalities are rising, but in most developing countries, inequalities have begun to rise in the last 10 years. And our own work indicates, and there is a chapter in the book on that even in China, which used to be one of the most equal countries 15 years ago, even there the inequalities have started to rise, and certainly in India and Brazil and South Africa and Chile, I can name them, and Don Enrique may refer to that later on. That is a very worrisome issue, not only because it affects economic growth, but it's even bigger issue socially, politically, etc. And we don't see how that can be controlled. So that's the second big issue. The third one is a little more complicated issue economically, is the issue related to productivity. How the world will be able to take advantage of technological change and innovation. The biggest difference between optimistic scenario and the pessimistic scenario is what will happen to the global productivity frontier, and particularly application of new technologies in the services sector, which is the bulk of the GDP in country after country and the global level. The good news is, and there's a chapter on that in the book, that there are green shoots, the positive signs, beginning of the positive signs, particularly in East Asia, that the new technologies, including artificial intelligence, computer technologies, digitization, is beginning to happen in services sector in East Asia, even more than in the US. If that innovation begins to spread beyond East Asia, in Europe, in North America, even more than it is happening now, in Latin America, and hopefully in Africa, then we'll be in good shape. If not, what may happen is some countries will do well, and other countries will be left behind. And therefore, the biggest worry we have in economic terms, that we may have a situation that much of East Asia, maybe joined with India, will begin to catch up with today's advanced countries, and we may see something like 6 billion people in the world out of total population of 9.5 billion people in 2060 being quite affluent, enjoying the income levels of living standards of Southern Europe today, Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and roughly 4 billion people in what I call the lagging regions of Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, remaining lagging, and we'll see two worlds. And that will not be a stable world. So, having said that, let me conclude by showing you quickly 10 megatrends, which are the underlying basis of this analysis, of this modeling. And these 10 megatrends, of course, do not anticipate what we call black swan events, like the pandemic, like what suddenly happened in Ukraine, which nobody anticipated. These black swan events may happen in the future, probably will happen in the future, which megatrends do not capture. So let me try to show you those megatrends quickly. So there are 10, there can be many. I had to restrict, me and my co-authors had to restrict them to 10 as a good discipline. So most countries and regions of the world and world as a whole, we think are affected, their future economic and social development is affected by these megatrends, not equally, but mostly. These megatrends combined with some domestic characteristics will determine the future of the world economy and regions and countries. And we think definitely these megatrends are pretty critical to the future of emerging market economies, but also quite a lot to advanced countries in Europe, in Asia, countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore, and North America. So what are these megatrends? Because of shortage of time, I will sort of give you a jet speed overview of that. First and foremost is the global population trends. Unlike what people think, I used to think, we are now entering an era where before 2100, year 2100, the global population is likely to peak, not continue to grow. Except for Africa, all other regions are beginning to enter a period of aging. By 2100, more than a quarter of population will be over age 20, 65, sorry. And only 19% of the population will be younger than year 20. Shockingly, if you read the Lancet study, which is published in December, and these numbers are based on Lancet study and not the UN study, by 2050, as many as 151 countries, all of them in Europe, but also many countries in Asia and North America, will be having fertility rates which are below the replacement level. And that's why not only countries like Italy and your own country, Spain, Germany, will be seeing declines in population by 2100, which will be half of what they are today. Japan, China. So we're going to see populations declining. The question is how much, not whether. The only exception in the world will be sub-Saharan Africa. So that's one. Second, we're going to an era where the world will be fast urbanizing. Already, Europe and North America are heavily urbanized. Latin America is close by. And now Africa and Asia are going to join these two regions. So by 2060, urban population will be over 7 billion people, and bulk of this additional urbanization will be, as I just said, in Asia, in countries like China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, and in sub-Saharan Africa, which has tremendous implications, not only socially, politically, but economically, building of infrastructure, urban management, money, etc., etc. Third big trend is the rise of middle and consumer classes. Already this year, more than 50% global population would have income levels which are classified by the World Bank as middle class or upper middle class. By 2060, as much as 80% of the world population, if all goes well, according to our central scenario, not optimistic scenario, central scenario, 80% of the population, that is 4 billion more people than today, will be having consumption levels which are equated with so-called middle class or upper middle class consumption. It has huge implications for demand for natural resources unless we change the way we live. But there's a positive side. Middle classes have different way of living, different demands on governance, honesty, lack of corruption, demand on politicians. Unfortunately, the fourth mega trend I already mentioned, rise of inequality within countries, very dangerous politically unless something can be done. And there's a very fascinating chapter in the book about it. In Paris, we had a long discussion on the subject. And one of the things we committed in Paris was that our forum will try to launch an initiative in collaboration with other institutions to see what can be done, country by country, region by region, to try to arrest this very dangerous trend which is underway right now. Climate change, I don't have to see much. We have a fascinating chapter in the book about what emerging markets themselves can do, because they are the ones who will be hurt the most by climate change. So they need to do something themselves instead of just saying it's a problem created by advanced countries and they should take care of it. That's not good enough. And luckily in Glasgow and now in the paper which we have in the book, leaders in emerging markets are beginning to recognize that they will suffer the most and therefore they can't stay silent, they have to take action themselves. I commend you to read that chapter. We are having a session at London School of Economics on this issue We're also launching the book at Oxford on the 31st of May. And then we'll be having, if you would, book launch events in India and some other emerging market countries in order to sensitize leaders in emerging markets. This is their problem as much as problems of the world as a whole. International trade is unfortunately moving in the wrong direction. Deglobalization, even though the world as a whole, including emerging markets, gained quite a lot through globalization in the last 70 years. We were lucky to have the Director General of World Trade Organization. She came in to talk to us in Paris. She used the term re-globalization, that globalization being very good for the world and emerging markets, that instead of the world segmenting and us going in the current direction, which is there's not enough cooperation, that she urged our forum, she's urging emerging markets to do something to reverse the current trend. And the term, as I mentioned, she was using was re-globalization. So this is an issue that, I agree with her, and something needs to be. I think the big powers and small countries alike need to rethink about the importance of global trade and value chains. Technological progress is very welcome, though there's some dangers on personal security, etc. But overall, many of the problems, climate change, etc., can be resolved if the technology can be put to constructive use. And there are 2 chapters in the book on that subject. And linked with that is what will happen to future of jobs, how would we work, not only we would work, how would your children work, how would your grandchildren work. It has fundamental impact on our lives, what kind of jobs will be lost, will be done by robots, how office work will work, how people will get medical attention, support, and what are new jobs coming. And this is something which not only you should be reading, this chapter, in my view, this chapter should be read by your children, your grandchildren, by school teachers, by ministers of education, because it will affect everybody's life. And I think the countries have to get ready for this future. What kind of educational system reforms are necessary? What should the children be learning? Not only in Africa or Asia or Latin America, even in Europe. Are we teaching people things for which there'll be no demand in future? Next to last mega trend, just as more and more issues like climate change require global cooperation, our current system is dysfunctional. It is not serving the need of the world, the multilateral system. It needs a reset. And the chapter on this subject presents very starkly why the current system is ineffective in tackling the real problems of the future, why there's a need for a fundamental reform. So I will urge you to look at that. And finally, if we can solve the problem that I've highlighted, then we could have a fairly bright future. And as I said, under not even the optimistic scenario, under the central scenario, we can see the global GDP increasing quite steadily, except for the next couple of years because of Ukraine war. And the income levels of the world will go up by 60%, could go up by 60%. The gap between advanced countries and emerging markets will narrow, even though the advanced countries will still have much higher per capita income, but East Asia will catch up quite a lot. The structure of the global economy will change dramatically. and I think I said it earlier, but it's worth repeating, that much of East Asia will enjoy the same living standards as much of Europe and North America today. And 60% of global GDP will be in emerging markets of today. The weight of Asia in the global economy will rise dramatically, and Asia will be more than 50% of global GDP as a share of global population, which is 50%. The worry is what will happen in sub-Saharan Africa, because its share of global population will be 40% by 2100, and its income level, per capita income, is not rising. So that's a big question. Thank you very much, Sylvie.
Thank you, Harinder. Maybe you want to very briefly say a few things about some of the conclusions, particularly related to the model of society we would likely to be evolving if we want to this optimistic scenario if we want it to happen.
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me that. We have, I want to say two things. One, if we have so many more people in the world, 4 billion more people who are consumers, middle class consumers, upper middle class consumers, I'm not sure that the earth can bear the weight of that extra consumption, that we have enough trees, the world can take more emissions, people can still live in big houses like people live in North America, they can have the same amount of air conditioning, they can drive the big cars. So in that sense, I'm very encouraged that in Glasgow people make promises, including emerging markets, of net zero. And as a chapter on climate change argues, that the promises made in Glasgow are not good enough, that there's a need to be even more ambitious. For example, instead of phasing out the internal combustion engine cars by 2035, maybe they should be phased out by 2030. But it's more than environment or carbon emissions. I think there's a need to rethink our way of living. We need to become more modest. And, you know, if you read the scriptures and if you talk to sadhus who go and live in the Himalayas, if you read the old scriptures of the Hindus or Jains or Buddhists, and Mr. Kamdasu is very religious and close to the Vatican, he says that we have to go back to the fundamentals and live more simply. So that's one point. I think that is not only good for our spirits, and it's more than just doing yoga in the morning. Rethink the connection between human beings and our planet. How much burden we can put on the planet. But the second, I will urge you to read the epilogue written by Michel Kamdasu, our founding co-chairman. And he says, and I agree with that because I worked with him on that chapter, that there's a need for new values, revival of ethics, that there's too much emphasis on short-term profits, for everybody looking for his own well-being, and in a way, he's criticizing very diplomatically, that's his style, of what has been happening in North America and New York, and I'm a US citizen by choice these days, one of my nationalities. There's a need to think more long-term, not in terms of planet, how we interact with fellow human beings, how we interact with our communities, how countries interact with each other. A reset of our morals and our ethics. He wrote that chapter also before what's happening in Ukraine. And on the last point, how countries interact with each other. What's happening in Ukraine is a perfect example of how nations should not act with each other.
Agree. Thank you, Harinder. So now I think we can have some comments or questions from you. Those who feel more, I would say, would like to pose their question in Spanish, you can. I'll try my best to translate it to Harinder in English. So please feel free to. Yes.
I'm Tony Avilés from Press TV. Bueno, lo hago en castellano porque I was working in the past with Indian companies 20 years ago, and my English is not very fluently. And el papel de India ¿cómo ve el papel de India en
How do you see the role of India
dentro del mercado del cambio climático
within this issue of climate change?
Por lo que yo conozco, I know the technology of Indian companies and bueno, en español porque sorry for my English. Porque conozco compañías de la India, sobre todo de gente joven, que está haciendo mucho desarrollo en el tema de cambio climático.
He's saying that he knows a lot of startup company in India that are doing a lot to fight climate change.
Esto dentro de un tiempo, ¿cómo lo ve usted?
Then, so how do you see this kind of example and?
Well, thank you. I think your question is very relevant. I would urge you to read the chapter on climate change. It was written by a very prominent Indian economist, the former Minister of Planning, or he was Vice Chairman of former Ministry of Planning of India. He wrote the chapter on what emerging markets economy should do, but always in the back of his mind was India. And he and I exchanged many drafts, and to some extent it reflects my biases, though it's his chapter with a co-author, with a young co-author. So let me start by saying that India today is the second largest country in terms of population, 1.25 billion people. In less than 10 years, it will have more people than China. Secondly, Himalayas are not only the tallest regions of the world, mountains of the world, but also are the source of the rivers which supply water to not only India, but also to China, to Bangladesh, to Pakistan, Nepal, Myanmar. And the glaciers on the Himalayas are beginning to melt. Third, that India is beginning to see the effects of climate change already. There are floods and there are droughts. It's beginning to affect the agriculture. On top of it, some of the most polluted cities in the world are no longer in China, but in India. The rivers are polluted. Ganges, the most sacred river the Indians have, is still polluted, even though Mr. Modi, a very powerful prime minister, pledged 9 years ago that he was going to clean up Ganges, which he's not succeeded. So it's a real problem. It's not a problem of 2050 or year 2100. It is a real problem. That is one of the reasons in Glasgow, India for the first time committed on net zero, unfortunately for 2070 and not 2060 or 2050. One of the recommendations of Mr. Ahluwalia's chapter is that India should actually be willing to voluntarily go to 2060. That India should begin to de-emphasize coal and think more in terms of going to electric cars, renewable energy. But the basic point is that India has moved away from saying this problem is caused by advanced countries, they should tackle the problem. We are poor and don't ask us to do anything. I think Indians are suffering. They should forget about saying who caused the problem. They are now the third largest emitters in the world. They're burning tons of coal. I'm asking my humble voice, I'm not in the government, I was never in the government, but whatever the forum can do, our small forum can do, we're going to press. The best news is that the Prime Minister Modi, for whatever reason, wrote a letter to Nick Stern last week. Maybe the chapter in our book was shown to Modi. Nick Stern has agreed our suggestion to go to Delhi 2 weeks from now to give a lecture. And Modi wrote to Nick Stern saying, I'm glad you're coming to Delhi. And has asked Stern, together with Ahluwalia, to see them. So India needs to begin to do something more. The reason Mr. Modi said India will, for the first time, agree to a date on net zero had to do something, I would like to believe, in the backroom lobbying by us, that India cannot say we are too poor and we can't make a commitment. He did make a surprise commitment, which nobody in India knew he was going to, because the whole bureaucracy was telling him, don't do it, but he did it. Because I think India, Brazil, South Africa have to do it just the Chinese are doing it. It's not a problem of the West, it's a problem of the whole world. And unlike India, China, South Africa, Brazil join it, the problem cannot be solved.
Thank you, Harinder. I think we have another question, sir, or the lady, I don't know.
Hi, thank you so much. I connect a lot with what you have said about the part of human behavior, and I focus on the productivity of small and medium-sized companies. Now they are going through the digital transformation, but I do feel that the transformation is really connected with the behavior itself, because the new way, the new paradigm is different. And I see that there is here is where I see the big difficulty. How are we going to manage to change this behavior from my interest to our interest? There I see a big difficulty in my line of work. Thank you.
Well, it's a very profound question. And as you hinted, it's not going to be easy. For your consideration. If you don't change, what is more risky? What is going to be more difficult? Is there more risk that you don't change? Or you change? The change is coming. The change is coming. Digitization is coming. You know, we had this fascinating discussion in Paris by one of the gurus, and world gurus on the subject. And he made the point in the future, because of digitization, there are only two actors, in his view, who matter. Two countries, the US and China. He made this very dramatic statement. No other country in the world matters in that game. And you are either going to be driven by the US standards or the Chinese standards. And in my view, within the US, there are only three centers which matter. Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Massachusetts, and now Northern Virginia. Oklahomas of this world, even Michigans of this world do not matter. Right? And in China, it's Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou. And everything in Silicon Valley starts with a small enterprise. And then they become big. They become Apple and Facebook. Facebook's founder was my son's classmate at Harvard. He was nothing. 22 years ago, he was a little guy, Zuckerman, in a Harvard dorm. And now he's one of the richest people. He created this company like Bill Gates. He dropped out of college. He was a tiny company. He was a company like yours. This is the genius of a system where you're given total freedom, flexibility, no bureaucracy. Silicon Valley, combined with Harvard or MIT. You are the future. But the country has to give you freedom.
So we have 5 more minutes, so another question or comment?
Thank you. This morning I was listening to the news and I heard about that the countries from now on can spend without limitations and take debt to boost their economies. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I wish that was true. I think let's start from the bottom. The bank may come to you and say, you can have a credit card and you don't pay any interest for 12 months. The bank may come and say, you can take, $500,000 loan and I'll give it to you a small interest rate, and then 2 years later they say, we'll take your house away unless you pay us. I personally think that there is no free lunch, right? Now the interest rates have started going up. They used to be negative, and now slowly, led by Federal Reserve, now ECB will come. We did have Mr. Kuroda of Japan with us. He led this trend towards negative interest rate and, issuing bonds and all that stuff. I think that era is coming to an end. I think so, right? And we today in emerging markets have the highest debt levels in history, particularly in Africa. They're going to pay dearly, dearly, as the interest rates become positive and high. Unfortunately, most of them will go to IMF. We've seen it in Sri Lanka, seeing it in Pakistan, we are seeing it in Egypt. Argentina goes to IMF with great regularity. They're the biggest customer IMF has. They renege and they go back to IMF. And this will happen with great regularity now in much of sub-Saharan Africa in the next 2 years. So there's no free lunch, unfortunately. I'm sad about it. And then it's people who pay the price of austerity which the countries have to impose, devaluation. But I'm sure Don Enrique will elaborate on that.
Thank you, Harinder. So we're closing this first part. Oh, there is one more. Can we take one more question, Pedro? Yes, okay. Okay. Very good.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to thank you for all the information that you gave to us today. I'm from Mexico City, and I want to ask, what do you think about, for example, we have a lot of problems, not just in Mexico, in the whole Latin America countries. For example, with the governments that don't want to listen, they going backwards, no, with all this climate change and all the renewable energies. So how are you going to distribute this information to our governments? Because our politicals, they don't listen, no, they don't want to take care of these problems. And also, what do you think about the drugs problems, no? That it's a huge problem that involves all the world, all the important economies, no? So what do you think about this?
Well, on your first question, it's a perfect lead into the next segment of our session, because when Mr. Garcia was head of CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, and he's very visionary, he asked us, together with business leaders in Mexico, to prepare a long-term vision for Mexico. And we did. I had the privilege of working with our team, and we prepared a book called A Report, which became later on a book, published both in English and Spanish, Mexico 2042, where we presented a set of analysis of history and then set of proposals what Mexico should do to solve some of the big problems, including 7 specific recommendations. And we presented it to the then 3 presidential candidates. They came to an open forum, so I'm sure Enrique will elaborate on that. The drug problem is a double problem. It's a problem of drugs as well as terrorism. The two are very linked. You know, it could be Afghanistan, could be Niger in Africa, country. And it's really linked to governance and lack of hope, corruption, and lack of incomes. And we had a session on Africa in Paris, and my colleague who wrote the chapter together with the former chief economist of African Development Bank, he used this in the summary word, this image, this portrayed the problem in a very neat manner. That in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not true for Morocco, by the way, was not true in Ethiopia until recently, but in a country like Niger, if you're a young person, you're growing up, you have to make a choice. Do you go to high school, a college, or you learn how to use a gun and join a gang? And today, in many countries in Africa, it pays more, not only in terms of money, there's more prestige in the society that you join ISIS and you're in business of kidnapping young girls and engage in drug smuggling. It's more prestigious than to become a teacher or a bureaucrat to earn a salary, or become a business person to start a small business. It's so sad. And they're the ones who smuggle drugs or smuggle women. It goes back to lack of hope, lack of trust, and whatever else, and corruption.
Yeah.
Serious problem. It's much more than Mexico.
Yeah.
Much more than Mexico. But I'm sure on your first question, Don Enrico will.
So, Harinder, I think we're going to take the last question.
Okay. I would like to ask about one trend which has not been identified in the study and has to do with the institutional configuration of supranational institutions. Okay, we have United Nations, and the way that it was created prevents the United Nations on enforcing some policies, because there are countries that have a veto authority, okay? But there is a clear lack of institutions that can influence the way that different trends have an impact. And I am truly convinced that the capacity to make our people, our population more happy depends on the continuous emergence of institutions that have power, perhaps not just an advisory authority, but even some strength and authority to enforce the implementation of policies that are well-being for the population that is being affected. What is your feeling about the evolution of supranational institutions?
Well, first let me say you're correct. The megatrend number 9 actually is about that issue. It's a double title. There's a chapter in the book about global governance and multilateral system. As I said, increasingly some of the big issues require action not only at the national level, but also the global level. And what we are saying is the current global system is not well suited, is not effective in helping take these joint issues, joint action at the global level. And of course, the apex of the global system is the UN. And at the top of the UN is the Security Council. And most of the global systems, institutions were created in 1944, 1945, after the Second World War. And these legacy institutions reflect the political and economic reality more than 70 years ago. And the focus of those institutions, whether it's the UN or the World Bank or IMF, and their governance, their power, reflects the reality of 1940s and 1950s. Yes, you know, mainland China now replaces Taiwan, but the voting rights, while China has greater voting rights, still do not reflect China or India's weight in the global economy. And that then has an impact on their credibility. So our chapter written by Sir Suma Chakravarti, who is president of EBRD, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, says these institutions do not have the credibility, they don't have the right focus, and they need reform, whether it's WTO or the UN, and then he focused on the Multilateral Development Bank, and also the fact that because China, for example, didn't trust the World Bank anymore, they've created their own institutions, so there's a duplication. And Ukraine is a good example. I mean, I'm coming back to your question. If you have Russia chairing the Security Council, and they have a veto right, and they wouldn't allow a resolution on Russia, on Ukraine war, but the Security Council and the UN is ineffective. Perfect example of what you're saying. You need a reform of UN and of the Security Council. Just the way you need a reform of IMF to fix the global monetary system, or you need a reform of the World Bank to tackle more effectively climate change, or the pandemic. You need a reform of WTO on the trading system. You need a reform of WHO so that the next pandemic is handled more properly. The global system is not serving the needs of today and definitely of 2040. I feel very strongly about it.
Thank you,
Sylvie,
Harinder.
back
I
to you.
think Pedro is going to say a
Pedro,
few words.
thank you.
No, thank you, Harinder and Sylvie. We're going to do a little break of 15 minutes. We will start at 12:45 with the second part. We will focus on Latin America with Luis Enrique Garcia. I want to thank you, Harinder. Thank you, Sylvie. And I think that we can do un aplauso.
Thank you.
Thank you.